Tell you what we'll do when we reconvene on January 28th. I just want to thank our volunteers, Cecilia and Joan, who are here on a regular basis and help people find this room, which is otherwise completely impossible. And also Emily and Ashley, who have been our student workers this semester, and we really appreciate that. And all the IAS staff, but I appreciate them daily, and I just want to note the ones I don't get around to telling very often. So we'll come back in January, on January 28th, and our talk that day will be called The Future of the Meme, # Iran Election, Activism, and Social Media. And our speaker will be Negar Motahedeh from Duke University, who's a cultural critic and film theorist, and she specializes in interdisciplinary and feminist contributions to the fields of Middle Eastern studies and film studies. And she has a new book out from Stanford University Press titled #Iran Election, #Solidarity and the Transformation of Online Life, which follows the protest movement around Iran's fraudulent presidential election in 2009 to investigate how social media platforms develop international solidarity. So it's worth coming back after the winter break. And we hope to see you on January 28th. I'm also really proud and happy to announce a coming attraction, so to speak, that will happen just as you all are probably leaving campus for the winter break, and that's the launch of the IAS's new journal, Open Rivers, Rethinking the Mississippi. It's an interdisciplinary online journal that recognizes the Mississippi River and rivers globally as a space for timely and critical conversations about people, community, water, and place. So watch your email for an announcement with the URL for Open Rivers, and we hope that you'll give us feedback on it. So today's talk, which is co-sponsored by the Department of English, and we're very grateful for that, is something that is in line with something that we've done several times this fall, and that is to try to create new kinds of synergies between the IAS's residential fellows and our Thursdays at 4 programming. So I'm going to hand the introduction of our speaker today, because it is our speaker is in fact her invitee, so to speak, over to Amit Yahav, who is an assistant professor in the Department of English and a current IAS fellow working on a project titled Moments, Qualitative Time in 18th Century Culture. So Amit.
So it's a great pleasure to introduce Deirdre Lynch to you today, and thank you, Jennifer, for making this visit possible, and all the IAS staff who have worked on it. Deirdre Lynch is currently Ernest Birnbaum Professor of Literature at Harvard University. She was until recently Chancellor Jacqueline Professor of English at the University of Toronto. She co-edited the Northern Anthology volume of Romantic Literature. She sits on numerous editorial boards, author of 2 books, editor of 2 collections, and the list can go on and on and on. The list of institutional achievements, but I think that what they all evidence is just how uniquely compelling and influential Lynch's research is, asking questions of importance for our current culture and answering these questions with a combination of wide historical knowledge and joyful literary analysis. More specifically, Lynch seeks to understand the transforming yet steady appeal of literature by investigating what people have done with it and what they continue to do with it today, and investigating the functions that literature has played in earlier centuries and continues to fill today. In her The Economy of Character, Novels, Market Culture, and the Business of Inner Meaning, published by the University of Chicago in 1998, and which won that year's MLA Prize for first book, Lynch finds that novels provided a coping mechanism, as she puts it, for their rapidly increasing readership in 18th century England, a readership that sought ways for negotiating the sense of self within an emerging consumer culture. As Lynch carefully mounts evidence for this thesis, she provides nuanced accounts of historical processes and attends to a rich subset of issues, ranging from the interface of work and leisure to the specific predicaments of women in a market society, while also offering subtle readings of novels by Frances Burney and Jane Austen. And most remarkably, while the economy of character practices a complete and persuasive methodological commitment to historical specificity, it also manages to maintain awareness of just how important characters continue to be to us, and how some of the characters' functions in the 18th century continue to be relevant today. In her second book, Lynch turns her vast historical knowledge and sharp intellect to examining what it means when people claim to love literature. Loving Literature, A Cultural History, published by the University of Chicago Press this year, makes the case for a transformation along the 18th century in what people expected to be able to do with the texts that they value. In the 17th century, people approached poems and stories as objects with use value. But during the following century, literature came to seem more like persons that solicit an emotional response. This understanding, Lynch continues, not only came to shape the attitudes of lay readers, but also to constitute the academic study of literature. Professing literature as we still do it today, Lynch argues, is not just about ways of knowing, but also about ways of feeling, as she puts it. And she thus reminds us of the continuing relevance of values that are neither economic nor epistemological at a time when the humanities are marginalized, and when many defenses of the humanities reduce it to how it might be serviceable to professions more lucrative than academic careers. So Lynch has already given us some intriguing and very useful ways for thinking about characters and then about literature. And today she promises to think with us about the even more general category of the book. What was a book is the title of her talk today, which I'm sure she will investigate with as carefully specific and as widely resonant terms as she had in her previously published work. So just let me clear the stage for this presentation and help me welcome Professor Deirdre Lynch.
Thank you for the very generous introduction and for the invitation. This is a return visit to Minnesota for me. I have to stop doing it in November and December. That's the pattern so far. So if you invite me back again, please invite me in April. So I know what it's like when the leaves are on the trees of this beautiful campus. But I'm very excited to be here and very honored by Amit's invitation. So can everybody hear me? I have a microphone and I cannot tell whether it's doing anything or not. It's okay, thank you. So I am in the very initial stages of a new project. As Amit said, I published a book at the start of this year. This new project has the working title, Paper Slips, Disassembling the Book in the Long 18th Century. And the slips in that title is something I'd like you to hear both as a noun and as a verb. And the disassembling is meant in part to evoke the sorts of procedures that one might undertake in the course of an autopsy. Well, the autopsy has been one persuasive model for the practice of book history at the present moment, since at the present moment we are supposed to be witnessing the death of the book. Indeed, Nicholas Negroponte of the MIT Media Lab prophesied some time ago that 2015 would in fact be the year of the book's extinction. Not quite there yet, I'm happy to say. 3 years ago, the American conceptual artist Jesse England created a website he entitled eBook Backup that grappled playfully with the model of media shift or media supersession that prophecies like Negroponte's entail. His photographs and explanatory narrative playfully challenge the account that frames the fortunes of the book as though they formed a narrative in which one medium tidally replaces another, in which the page in straightforwardly linear fashion gives way to the screen. Jesse England does this by inverting that before and after narrative, by recording the process by which, in his words, he created, I quote, a physical, tangible, human-readable copy of an electronically stored novel. To quote from his words, which I myself just reread on my laptop screen, The purchased contents of an ebook reader were easily photocopied and clip-bound to create a shelf-stable backup for the benefit of me, the book consumer. A second hardcover backup has been made with the help of an online self-publishing house. You can see what it looks like. The final stage in the process, likewise illustrating a thorough entanglement and interdependency between print and digital media, is captured in my fourth slide, which depicts the ebook backup as read on the ebook reader from which it was photographed. And England adds a caveat rather dryly here. The backup is best viewed in paper format. Now, these answers to the question, what is or what was a book, offered 3 years ago, reinforce how far from being self-evident the nature of the book is within 21st century media ecology. And I've come here wanting to talk with you about how this was equally the case in the late 18th and 19th century, the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a moment that we retrospectively think of as the high watermark in the book form's stability. Current discussions of media shift have often tended to back project into the past a rather homogenized and idealized account of the book and the reader. William Paulson, for instance, has declared that, I quote, electronically stored and retrieved text, in comparison with its printed predecessor, is almost infinitely malleable and labile. His contrast between the digital text's openness to modification and recontextualization and the stasis of cold print has, since he articulated it 20 years ago, become something of a commonplace. Jeffrey Noonberg, too, has proposed a similar effect that, again I quote, a medium like the web makes it possible to actualize intertextuality to the point of eradicating all the boundaries and divisions between texts, so that we arrive finally at a perfect Derridian débordement of meaning, a text that cannot shut out other texts. As he explains, when we are moving amongst web documents, there need be no material difference, say, between the link that takes us to the subsequent chapter of a text and the link that takes us to one of its predecessors, or to a commentary on it, even if these linked texts are stored at different sites. Well, I think you've heard all of this before, and my recent research has left me lamenting the simplifying effects of this style of before-after contrast between a print and a digital age. Autopsies are undertaken so that one might see better. One thing I have been able to see better by virtue of working in book history at a moment when my object of study is supposed to be at death's door, if not beyond it, at a moment when paper is supposed to be slipping away. One thing that I've seen is that book history, in creating its familiar narratives about the book's heyday in a period of stability and fixity, never took into account the history of blank books and what people did with those. Is a blank book a book? Does it become one when we filled it up? Is a book when there's nothing in it? Or only a book incipient, as Leigh Hunt, the Romantic period writer, put it in a poem on albums? Part of my research agenda in Paper Slips is to figure out what happens when we admit the blank book in the Romantic period, as now a highly lucrative staple for booksellers, to full membership within book history. So this is the kind of blank book that I'm talking about, from about 1752, when Robert Dodsley, a very important 18th century publisher, put out a blank book called A New Memorandum Book. These things were staples for the publishing industry, just as now, right, they're the thing that keep bookstores alive, that display of moleskin notebooks that we see near the cash register. Now, I have been working on the handwritten contents that people insert into their blank books for a while. When I was doing the research for Loving Literature, the book I published at the start of this year, I became very interested in looking to manuscript commonplace books from the 18th and 19th centuries. Books of excerpts recording a course of study, for instance, or a reader's choice of greatest hits. My aim in my earlier research was to find evidence for reading practices in the past. That's always the holy grail for a book historian. In part, I was hoping to document what those past readers read. The amateur commonplace book, with its collection of handwritten, transcribed excerpts, can represent a kind of people's anthology, as one of its historians puts it. You look at books from the early 19th century and you find out just how popular Felicia Hemans was, when kind of every fourth poem is by Hemans, and you find out that almost nobody was reading Shelley or Keats. So a kind of people's anthology. So I was wanting to document what past readers read, but I was looking as well for evidence of something more elusive, how they read, or more precisely, how they styled themselves as lovers of literature. I got interested in the desires to which this odd practice of copying out and turning print back into handwriting seemed to attest. Desires, for instance, to prolong one's time with a text past the time of its reading, to memorialize that reading so as to mark it as a kind of red letter day in one's life as a reader, to personalize one's relationship with commodities sold in an increasingly impersonal marketplace, even in fantasy, perform a kind of service for a beloved author. I love Byron, so let me act as Byron's scribe, copy over again what his hand traced, incorporate his gestures into my own. This labor with pen and pencil, also in its effects of recontextualization, converts writings by authors, Shakespeare here. If my slide were a little better, you would see some Spencer. This labor with pen and pencil, also in its effects of recontextualization, converts writings by authors into love tokens to authors. And you're now looking at a page in a manuscript book from 1817 that documents, I think, one such effort. Well, this was what I did in my previous book, but my discovery in the course of this research was that I had to complicate my assessment of the commonplace book, because the commonplace book that presented itself as the repository of the traces of an individual's reading was, by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, situated on a continuum with a very different sort of handwritten, homemade book that I couldn't instrumentalize for my own research purposes quite as readily. My view was corrected by a series of archival encounters with that latter kind of book in various libraries, assembled in various locations, from South Carolina to Quebec City, to Carbonear, Newfoundland, to Glasgow, to Manchester, to Tuthill Fields Prison, where at that time the assembler of one such book, the Chartist Ernest Jones, was jailed for sedition. These are books for which we don't really have a name. Librarians and archivists don't really have a good way of cataloging them, as I've found to my despair. I've been referring to them alternately as scrapbooks, a term that enters English usage in 1828, according to the OED, and as albums, the term that had previously been coined from Latin, albus, white, to designate a blank book bought in that condition and subsequently filled out by its purchaser. Their owners came up with all manner of names for them, not confining themselves to those. On their opening pages, title pages, we would say, if we accepted that these really were books, and not just as the Romantic period essayist Charles Lamb would have said at the time, biblia non biblia, things in books, clothing. On their opening pages, I've come across such terms as memorials of friendship, potpourri, or a collection of good, bad, and indifferent, original compositions and extracts in prose and verse, effusions of fancy and fun, cabinet of music, poetry, and drawing, manuscripts, or the beauties of the English writers. You will also notice, or would if I were a better photographer, that on this page, which is a handwritten and facetious mock-up of a printed title page, a certain Elizabeth Reynolds both adopts a handwriting designed to imitate the look of print typeface and facetiously, at the very bottom of this page, identifies herself as the publisher of a medley or scrapbook. And she includes the information expected of every book, even one that exists as a manuscript only in one unique copy. She includes the information about publication, publisher, date, place of publication. Now, a parenthetical note about terminology might help me to preempt some confusion here. Scrapbook only gradually came to be reserved for a book devoted to material that had been scissored out and pasted in from other sources. And at the start of the 19th century, in contrast to our current usage, the term was readily used as here for a book whose contents were mainly copied in by hand, or for a book that mingled pre-printed clippings with handwritten transcriptions. Reynolds, who uses the word scrapbook as her subtitle in 1817, 9 years before the Oxford English Dictionary discovers its first use in print, applies that moniker to a book whose nature she establishes, and these are the epigraphs on this page, by copying out quotations from Shakespeare, whose Gratiano speaks of an infinite deal of nothing, and from Charles Churchill, who writes of a slight shot silk for summer wear, just as our modern pastimes are, and from La Bruyère, who protests against tout chagrin. These are more extroverted productions than the commonplace book, which is generally viewed as the record of private study. They are still, to some degree, customized anthologies maybe, but they're also vehicles of social display rather than private, studious immersion. Their assemblies sometimes enrolled entire social circles, with multiple persons contributing their offerings, sometimes individual pages to be bound or more frequently pasted in, to a bibliographic space that would frequently be supervised and curated by one lady in particular. This is the practice celebrated with the self-promotion typical of much album verse by the poetic address that opens a manuscript book from about 1824 that is now in the National Library of Scotland. Hither, knights and ladies gay, the poem is terrible. Each an offering bring, I pray. Picture right or maxim wise, tuneful lay or painted flies, verses all like pearls strung, doggerel ne'er by poet sung, autograph or great or small, here is ample space for all. None a token can refuse, since it is a lady's sues. The account of this practice that is likely more familiar to some of you comes in an early chapter of Jane Austen's Emma, where we hear of the thin quarto of hot-pressed paper ornamented with ciphers and trophies that little Harriet Smith has made up for Emma Woodhouse, and in which Emma is collecting specimens of riddles that she has requisitioned from their acquaintance and has also copied out from published sources, like Robert Dodsley's Newfoundland Hospital for Wit, with disastrous effects, as some of you will know if you remember what happens with Harriet Smith's interpretation of a riddle. Now, offerings made to these books could be original compositions, or they could be handwritten transcriptions from printed published sources. The latter could sometimes be transcribed with acknowledgement of their origins, sometimes without. The books often were presented as the keepsakes that memorialized the social exchanges involved in their making, and which would be cherished nostalgically in later years. On a page in a homemade book that is assembled in 1795 and given the title Memorials of Friendship, a certain Elizabeth Wagner copies out a stanza of Thomas Gray's hyper-canonical poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, a stanza about how the boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour, the paths of glory lead but to the grave. And then she adds, when exploring the latent excellencies of this stanza, may memory remind you of your eternal friend and deeply affectionate sister, Elizabeth. This kind of gift-giving seems to have gone on in a manner that might invite those of us too old to be digital natives to identify it with the mixtapes that we made in the 1970s and 80s when we sought to solicit from our special friends sympathy with our oh-so-unique musical tastes. The Pforzheimer collection of the New York Public Library, for instance, holds a book that has on its opening page the following handwritten words: "The leisure hours amusement of a young lady, presented by her as a token of grateful remembrance to her friend, Mr. E.S.U." Proceed further, however, and 138 pages in, one encounters a second dedicatory page, inscribed with the words, "Part the second, dedicated with affectionate esteem to B.P., presumably traced by the pen of Mr. E.S.U., who's decided to regift this. Now, the books are also multimedia productions, another way that they differ from commonplace books, and the offerings their several makers contribute to them can include images in watercolor, or pen and ink, or musical scores, as well as pieces of prose and verse, whether original or transcribed or clipped out of mass-produced print sources. So here was one puzzle that confronted me in studying these books and thinking about their implication for the book. With some consistency, the manuscript books of this period project an image of their makers as literary people who live to read. Here's a great page from Elizabeth Reynolds' scrapbook or medley. These people style themselves as readers who will, for instance, take pains to envision and give body to the characters of Walter Scott's fiction and metrical romances, or they present themselves as people who would like to pay tribute at beloved authors' grave sites. But participants in the making of these books also regularly depart from the medium that was selected by the authors they revere. And so they also make the books serve as a showcase for decoupage, calligraphy, flower painting, fern pressing, and other feminine accomplishments of the era. The album could showcase its owner's social and literary capital, as with the anonymous Pforzheimer Library album that begins with a rather bossy poem calling on all those who look on the album to contribute an original poem. I'll have none of your extracts from volumes in print, no stanzas from Byron, no lyrics from Moore, no gleanings from Scott's inexhaustible store. In fact, this book is full of Byron and Scott transcripts. But at the very same time that it shows off this person's literary capital, it could also showcase the lady's dexterity with her scissors. Leafing through that same Pforzheimer Library album, one encounters not only stanzas from Byron, despite the opening threat, but also this rather delightful pop-up book page of a cottage, which is, once you tug on the attached ribbon, revealed as a mousetrap, whose delicately cut bars hold 2 jailed mice inside. I wish I could do it as a GIF or something, but there we go. Now, these books claimed about 10 printed pages in Loving Literature, but even before completing the writing of the book, I decided that I wanted to work on this project that I'm calling Paper Slips, and more broadly work with the questions that the books raised for me. One reason why, as I've already intimated, they have such a wonderfully tonic, corrosive effect when you juxtapose them with some of the discipline's narratives about the relations between published books and their readers in the 18th and 19th centuries, narratives about the sorts of users or experiences the books have sponsored. It's a commonplace to state, as Roger Chartier does in the opening of A History of Reading in the West, that print, I quote, enforced a strict limitation on the reader's ability to intervene in the book. The print object imposed its form, structure, and spaces on the reader, and no material physical participation on the reader's part was supposed. Well, this statement excludes the blank book from the category of print object, though, as I've said, blank books were staple retail items for job printers, and early 19th century publishers like Taylor and Hesse made far more money, for instance, from the Student's Journal, a blank book, than they ever did from the poems of Keats, which they also published. And the problem with this exclusion of the blank book from our narratives of book history is how it might prompt us to overlook the challenge that it mounts to visions of the book as a static, stable, fixed object. It might prompt us to overlook the ways in which those snowy leaves between the covers invite readers to clip, both figuratively and sometimes literally, from published texts. But those blank pages invite readers to conceptualize others' writings as malleable, abridgeable, rearrangeable, and rewritable. Hence, for instance, transcripts of Byron lyrics in the albums I've consulted, in which a he becomes a she, and vice versa. The distinctive kind of print object that is the blank book encouraged and assisted in the detachment of poetic texts from their authors and original context, and their circulation in partial, unidentified, misquoted form. It encouraged as well the copying and remobilizing of images that were loose from the titles and captions that had regulated their meaning. The blank book unbinds other books. It is a book that comes together, only as other books come apart. A sort of drive compels us to take the book apart, to make it into a piece of lace. That sentence isn't mine, though its loveliness makes me wish it were. It is rather booty from my own unbinding. Given my subject, I should own up to my own clipping. The sentence originates with the 1980 lecture series of Roland Barthes entitled The Preparation of the Novel, in which, thinking mainly of the example of the poet Mallarmé, he places the album in contrapuntal relationship to the book, contrasting the embrace of contingency distinguishing the former, an anthology of chance inspirations, to the seeming order and finality of the latter. Barthes also comments on how the future of the album might be the book. This is so if you consider the album to be the mass of notes that is collected together with the book in view. And he comments on how, conversely, in the future, the book will become album once more. Their respective situations on a timeline are not the only contrasts between the album and book that Barthes identifies. A page of an album can be moved or inserted at random, Barthes pointed out, with one eye on the poems of Mallarmé, and then added that such a procedure was absolutely contrary to the book. We might qualify Barthes' contrast and say instead that the blank book highlights possibilities only latent in the print book. This was only an aside on Barthes' part, but I have set out to study that lace-making, as he puts it. It is intriguing to ponder the tension that these manuscript books often make visible between the book form and the page, the loose leaf. Books exist as books thanks to, as one book historian puts it, the obedient collaboration of their pages. We know that by around 1770, there was a well-entrenched expectation that under modernity's system of industrial production, the printed book would come into readers' hands with all its leaves present and in the correct order. The term collator enters English then as the moniker for the person whose office it is to examine the signatures on the sheets and ascertain that the publishing house's products conform perfectly to an ideal originary order of assembly. But pages are not only inked and numbered, and then, later, in readers' hands, churned and read. Pages are also torn and clipped and slip their moorings within the book, and they camouflage as well the things that we, by design or in absent-mindedness, slip into books. And considered as a scrap or a slip, that loose leaf is something more complicated, something more rebellious than a synecdoche of the book. I want to suggest that it is the blank book's nature to foster that rebelliousness of the loose leaf at the very same time that, as a book, it houses and contains it. Evidence that I've seen so far suggests that the album and scrapbook makers of the Romantic period often took some pains to foreground the difference between the manuscript book and the printed one. There appears, for example, to have been considerable investment in the idea that the customizable book, blank book, so much more porous in its relationship to the world than the published printed book can be, might serve as a scene on which to represent chance and contingency. Now, to make that point less abstract, maybe we could consider some pages from the book that a certain pair of amateur manuscript bookmakers, E and T Wilson, I only know their initials, assembled in Manchester between about 1800 and 1830. The page's surface here is endowed with an illusory third dimension, right? This is all just watercolor and ink on the two facing pages. Without actually being a collage, it looks like one, a textual horn of plenty composed of overlaid paper scraps, inviting the beholder to believe that there might be still more layers of textual fragments for her to sift through, that she's only scraping the surface. This page is in some measure a witty celebration of the miscellaneity, the promise of providing something for everyone, to which the scrapbook is often committed. Here's another example. This sort of page seems to proclaim the amateur copyist's and book borrower's right in a world of textual plenitude to share in the surplus, to glean from, for instance, Scott's inexhaustible stores. And here the page is something more than a surface on which to write out lines of verse or riddles. There's some riddles at the top of this one in the top right-hand corner, and blocks of prose. E and T Wilson have also painted the slips of paper that their detached quotations are on, and consequently they image papers on paper, loose leaves getting dog-eared. Better in this one, right? We see the dog ear at the bottom on the sort of 2/3 of the way along. Papers strewn across the page with abandon, as if flocking together, only to fly apart once more. Notably, they have also inserted into this mix, in both the pages that I showed you, a slip in a different horticultural sense of the term, a cutting taken from a plant, also depicted in the trompe-l'oeil style that makes the viewer hallucinate a third dimension to this paper-thin image. There's another little botanical slip at the bottom of that one. Here's another page from a homemade book, this one from 1821, Miss Mary Watson's The Scrapbook, containing a choice and amusing selection from the standard and floating literature of the last 12 or 15 years. Those are the words that Miss Mary Watson, whoever she might have been, put on her title page. This page is her homage to Lord Byron, less to his works than to his scandalous life, fashioned in a way that looks to me like a ransom note. In the early 19th century culture of the tasteful excerpt, picking texts apart was a tried and true way to draw readers together. Such, at least, was the premise, my colleague Leah Price has taught us, of many of the published anthologies of the era, which aspired to form a public by facilitating the reading of a manageable quantity of verse and prose excerpts. What to make, though, of the literalism with which Miss Watson approached the project of picking texts apart? Earlier in the book, she has sat floating across the space of the page. This is the page she goes, this is the recto of the Byron page. So we go from scandalous Lord Byron to a Christian library, which I think has to have been deliberate. And on an earlier page, she also sets floating, without explanatory context, such clipped out, deracinated words as books, literature, read, female literature, and art of reading, a display of the buzzwords of the era that here, as elsewhere in this book's pages, make the book appear in anticipation of modernist collage. The scrapbook also has a diaristic quality, not just a record of her reading life, but simultaneously a record of her social appointments. She has used her hoard of little bits of the detritus of the 19th century paper world, fragments of newspaper announcements, advertisements, and handwritten letters to preserve the itinerary of her days. That approach to a diaristic impulse bears out a punning claim about books made in the same decade of the 1820s in William Hazlitt's essay on reading old books. Books, Hazlitt says, form links in the chain of our conscious being and bind together the different scattered visions of our personal identity. The pun on bind is central to Hazlitt's bibliographic imagining of the self, Still, these records of Mary Watson's industry with scissors project an account of personal identity in which the binding can never quite offset the scattering. Since beginning to pore over volumes like these, I've noticed all over again how much, in fact, the published authors that I've been studying and teaching for years have invested in floating an account of the book in which their text, too, will appear as somehow open to the manifestations of chance and contingency. They are also interested in loose-leaf susceptibility to flying or being torn or being scissored away. Some of you might remember here, for instance, the sermon of Parson Yorick's that is found when, in Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, Corporal Trim, one of the servants, takes a little bit too literally the request that he look inside a book about siege engines that he's fetched from his master's library and see whether he can spot there anything about a sailing chariot. To comply, Trim gives the volume a good sound shake. "There is something fallen out, however," said Trim, "and please your honor, but it is not a chariot or anything like one." Well, that something turns out to be a manuscript sermon, identified as such because it begins with a text of scripture and chapter and verse, and then, as Trim says, goes on not as a chariot, but as a sermon directly. And here, that scene where he starts reading aloud from the sermon that is dropped out of the book in which it has somehow come to be lodged. I love how what is inside a book is here the outside of this volume of Tristram Shandy. There's a weird non-Euclidean geometry going on here. There are other examples I could give you. You might remember that Austen's Emma Woodhouse, conversing with her father about one particular offering for the volume that she's putting together, the acrostic addressed to Miss Blank, whose misconstruction is about to have some awkward social consequences. She speaks of a piece of paper found on the table this morning, dropped, we suppose, by a fairy, and just now copied into our book. Well, Emma's feckless fairy, who drops things, is a figure for that mobility of paper that Sterne also references with that wandering sermon of Parson Yorick's. Poems also tumble out of books on scraps. Poems on scraps of paper also tumble out of books in ways that cause the hero no little embarrassment in two incidents found in Walter Scott's novel Rob Roy. I could go on, but won't, about novels' representations of paper slips and representations of how paper slips. Generally, I am the only person in a century or more who's turned over the pages of the books that I've been showing to you. Not this one, but the manuscript books. But the point of references I've just made to published works that, by contrast, some of you might have read and reread is this: to suggest that a project on paper slips can be one that's located at the seam between material cultural studies and the history of literary form, the history of how literary genres mediate meaning. Thinking along with these books about the question, what is a book, can lead one to wonder, for instance, anew, what is a poem? Album verse written originally for an album, or verse transcribed and inscribed onto an album page, might tell us something about the condition of the lyric poem more generally. It might tell us about the generalizability over distance that is the flip side of the intimacy of lyric address, and tell us about how portable or generic sentiment can be. In the album now in the National Library of Scotland that a certain Sarah Rogers began to fill up around the year 1822, for instance, someone has devoted a page to Letitia Landon's evocatively titled poem, Lines Written Beneath a Picture of a Girl Burning a Love Letter, a poem that entangles its story of love with the story of the fortunes of a piece of paper, loose leaf consigned to the flames. In that album page's bottom right-hand corner, one finds first the initials LEL for Letitia Landon, and then under those, the initials FB with the date March 7th, 1826, a doubling of authorial signature that suggests, I think, confidence that these lines, which are about lines, might speak for two people, both the poet and the transcriber. Album verse might also tell us something about the romantic lyric more generally when it makes the subjection to material contingency that arises from its dependence on the paper medium its overt topic, when it thereby makes reference to the context that is constituted by the blank book's operation as an engine of decontextualization. To suggest how it does this, let me lay out for you 2 titles of published poems, at least one of which I've found not just in a printed book, but also transcribed in an album. The first is James Montgomery's poem, Epitaph on a Gnat, G-N-A-T, found crushed on the leaf of a lady's album. And then second, I love that one, and I did find that one in an album, but not with a gnat. And then second, there is the poem that appeared in the first volume of the Southern Literary Messenger, soon to be edited by Edgar Allan Poe, and that is entitled Lines Written in an Album on Pages Between Which Several Leaves Had Been Cut Out. Its speaker begins in a manner at once elegiac and waggish, with a series of questions about the now absent. What leaves were these, so rudely torn away? Whose immortality thus roughly foiled? What aphoristic dogs have had their day and of their hopes being suddenly despoiled? And it continues in a comparable vein. A score of petty minstrels might have lain and like the abbey sleepers found good lying in this brief space, but none, alas, remain. Thou'st sent their ashes to the 4 winds flying. Well, this poet might be seen, I'm pressing at the boundaries of the plausible here, but I sort of want to think that this poet, in his interest in lines that have gone missing and leaves that have gone missing, might be seen as a forerunner to Jesse England, the conceptual artist with whom I began. England tells the following story about the motives that he had for the website he titles eBook Backup. He writes he has on his website these words. In 2009, some Amazon Kindle users found their copies of George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm had been removed from their Kindles without their prior knowledge or consent. Those particular copies were offered for sale by a publisher who did not have the proper rights to do so. After consumers spoke out about having a book taken from them without their consent, Amazon later reinstated the copies taken from those who purchased the book or offered gift cards as compensation for the inconvenience and promised never to repeat such an event in the future. Love that story about kind of a book that behaves badly. To return to my question, what is a book? The books from the late 18th and early 19th centuries that I've been studying also behave badly. The codex form is here more dynamic and disorderly than we ordinarily like it to be. Multiple albums are, for instance, written out in 2 directions, both from back to front and front to back. This means that reading one of them, you must at a certain point turn it upside down, with thoroughly disorienting results for anyone accustomed to the linearity of print. The album often functions in this way as 2 books in one, beginning repeatedly but lacking a clear sense of an ending. This book is, furthermore, often mobile in its contents, as the poet for the Southern Literary Messenger implied. Over the years, some of the pages are likely to have been cut out. New materials will have been tipped or pasted in over top the old. This is the case, for example, with the album kept by that famous British emigrant to Kentucky, John Keats's sister-in-law, Georgiana Wiley Keats, which had a whole layer of newsprint over top the handwritten transcripts, which, when it was bought by a Keats lover, all of those clippings were stripped away. What is a book? Well, we can also supplement that question with this one. What is the force of the preposition in that trips up Stern's corporal trim? What is in books? How do we distinguish between a book and a portfolio, a book and a file folder, and a book and a box, or a book and a specimen cabinet? The cabinet might well, after all, contain the gnat itself. We do get pressed flowers, there's a forget-me-not, and hair wreaths, after all. Scrapbook and album practice frequently exploits just how effectively a book can serve as a thing for storing other things. In early 19th century Germany, albums, Stammbücher, as they were often called, were often literally boxes. This is a little box, little bijou box like this one, whose contents are loose oblong leaves that have been inscribed, painted, and sometimes embroidered by their owner's family and friends, and that can be shuffled in various orders as though they were a deck of cards. These albums, in particular, are souvenirs of home, assembled in the face of the owner's impending immigration. Here's another one. It's a surprisingly sentiment-laden locus in which to encounter an anticipation of the non-linear combinatorial literature that was cultivated by experimental writers in the 1960s, like Mark Saporta, for instance, whose composition number 1 is a loose leaf novel that comes in a box whose pages can be read in any order. What book signifies here is a provisional sort of storage system, a collection point for slips and scraps, and also a way station these paper objects occupied previous to their further detachment and transportation elsewhere. What was a book? In the Romantic period, as in the postmodern era, loose leaf that was and that may once more return to that state. Thank you.
We'll let you field your own questions.
I'm happy to field questions. This is a very new, scrappy sort of project, so I'm very eager to have your feedback. And I have sort of bombarded you with many examples in the hope that one of them will spark something in somebody in the audience and help me think through this strange project. Yeah, thanks, John.
These look weirdly familiar to me as an Elizabethan.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what is the relationship between the materials that you're working on and something like the 25,000 Elizabethan commonplace ones?
That's it. One would be that kind of your people, if I may call them that, your people are still customizing their print in much readier ways, right? If I'm thinking of Jeffrey Todd Knight's book, Bound to Read, about the ways in which people would compile all sorts of strange bedfellows within a single binding. That is becoming, though the books are still being sold for the most part in boards. Blank books are actually some of the first to come pre-bound. By and large, that miscellaneity that was the sort of ruling premise of people's way with printed books has, I think, gone into abeyance to some extent. So my commonplace books are doing something that transgress more radically the kind of protocols of the printed book at that period.
Yeah, we don't have ferns and lots of hair.
Yeah, but you have cloth scraps. I gave a paper on a panel with Juliet Fleming recently, who's doing stuff on Renaissance collage. So there's certainly sort of fabric, and there is some. There is a sort of multimedia aspect even to the Elizabethan commonplace book, but you don't really have the notion of feminine accomplishments in the Elizabethan period that make these so very wild. Yeah, but it's an excellent question. And Andy?
When you began talking about scrapbooks, my mind went to the cheesy mid-20th century melodrama Dial M for Murder, which is a Hitchcock movie in which, in the pivotal scene, the evil husband who wants to bump off his wife has left her to assemble her scrapbook. And the murderer comes in to get whom he's hired to get the wife, and she eventually stabs him with the scissors.
That's wonderful.
That's a gift. the violence of that made me aware of how much cutting is involved in this.
Yeah.
And I'm interested, so I know that usually books were not bound, so you had to cut them. Were the blank books also, did they also need to be cut?
No, not as often.
So
Yeah.
I'm just thinking to read, you needed to cut your pens. You
Right,
needed to cut your books.
Yeah.
And then they're doing more cutting.
Yeah.
And the poem was
Absolutely.
about pages being cut out.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in the cut.
Yes, well, I mean, if I were further along in this project, I would also be putting these books into conversation with the mainly masculine hobby of extra illustrating books, which involves, I'm just not far enough along in my research yet, which involves people deciding, I am such a lover of Shakespeare, let me destroy all of these other books in order to illustrate from the outside, rebind or paste in things that will illustrate these lines of Shakespeare. So there is in the Folger Library a book, an edition of the works of Shakespeare that was sold in 6 volumes at the beginning of the 19th century that was, because of the efforts of this extra illustrator, it's now 21 volumes because he's stuck so many other pieces of paper inside it. So scissors and paste are I think, like adjuncts to reading in ways, I mean, just as my former colleague Heather Jackson, my University of Toronto colleague Heather Jackson, did a book about kind of how normal it was to write in books, how this was part of the protocol of reading. I think kind of scissors work was to a greater extent than we've realized part of the protocols of reading. It wasn't I mean, some people might have seen it as a desecration of books, and certainly if you found your own book having been scissored up in order to illustrate somebody else's, you might well feel that, and I'm, waiting for the day when I find that my own book has been used as, we don't kind of line pastry tins with pages of books anymore.
Cut and paste in Word.
Yeah.
Function. So your
That's
physical
right.
book might not, but
Yeah,
your Word
indeed,
should
yes,
be.
no, absolutely, yeah.
So more scissors and paste. I'm struck by the ways in which the sort of pop up with the mice underneath is reminiscent of anatomy books that
Yes.
have layers of pop-ups in essence. So I'm kind of curious, what would people's models for doing this have been? Because you don't think of anatomy books having wide circulation.
I know, it's such an interesting question, and it's like one of those that it's really difficult, like where do these ideas come from? I mean, there's a lot of, it's clear that scissors were cutting out silhouettes, things like that is a kind of accomplishment. There's a wonderful artist who, since you work on the history of science, you might have come across Mary Delaney, right, who does these astonishing, botanically correct collages to kind of give us various species of flowers. But it's really hard to know kind of how, they're almost memes. Like I've read enough of, I don't know if that's the right verb, I've looked at enough of these now to see certain things that kind of get repeated from one to another. Books made at very geographically dispersed locations, but I don't know how you would know to do these things except by looking at other people's books. I mean, it was so popular a practice and so much, I think, part of early 19th century sociability that by the 1830s in the United States, you could buy albums already filled out that you could pretend were your own. In other words, that you had done all the work, but they had been made kind of tailor-made for you, so the people who sell pre-printed album covers or frames for images in albums also start selling the things themselves so that you could put it on the parlor table and take credit for it, even and pretend that you had all these friends who had given you their contributions. So I don't know how to answer your question except to say that the kind of questions about transmission are the ones that I've begun to knock my head against. I just don't have that story down yet, but it's an excellent question.
Have you ever considered making one yourself?
I wanted my students to do it. I had my Harvard students do it. They did stuff on sort of the fan culture of Austen's era, and at the end I said they could make their own little bits of Austenian fan culture. And I really wanted one of them to make an album. One did extra illustrate a copy of Pride and Prejudice, which just delighted me beyond measure. But no, if I had more time.
Understandable.
Yes. Yeah.
I have a question that you alluded to when you referred to the extra illustrated books as being done typically by men. I was thinking of them as a category in distinction to the examples you were giving where you repeatedly use the female pronoun.
Yeah.
And so there's a difference worth considering. And what is the demography of that difference? Or another way to put it is, are any of the examples that you have compiled by men?
Yes, absolutely. Ernest Jones, I mentioned him, makes one when he's in jail for sedition. He makes an album. Sorry.
So how does that dynamic work?
Yeah.
Is it a female space in which a man can be creative, or what's happening?
I think that the reason more extra illustrators are men is because it takes quite a bit of money to be an extra illustrator, and because you were just spoiling all of these other books. But the men whose albums I've seen, I haven't seen any signs of self-consciousness about how they're intruding on a feminine space. So I've seen, it's often the case is that you only have the initials, so you have no idea who made them, right? And I think men were expected certainly to contribute pages to a lady's album, but I have seen albums that belonged to, as I said, Ernest Jones, the zoologist or natural historian Philip Henry Goss kept one. He's the one who kept one in Newfoundland in the 1830s. It looks identical to all of the ones that I know were made by people with names like Miss Mary Watson and Miss... Nothing would distinguish it. James Stanier Clark, who's in Jane Austen circles, lives in infamy because he's the person who suggested to Austen that she really ought to try writing something new, and how about a historical romance based on the history of the House of Saxe-Coburg. He kept one. He did one with transcripts of poems and his own watercolor drawings, watercolor paintings. So it's not, I think just as we have, novel reading got gendered female without much evidence except sort of popular representations of reading always being sort of the lovesick girl. I think this practice gets gendered female by commentators, again, without much evidence. I mean, published authors, when they write about this, they write about it in often a very derisive way, right? And you can see why. It violates their copyright. It doesn't really, but notionally, right? It sort of says, oh, amateurs make books too. So you have some of the disdain of the professional for the amateur in a lot of sort of published commentary on these books. And I think that what goes with that disdain is often a sort of gendering of it as female. It's a very long and complicated answer. I mean,
Can you put up the one of the student notebook?
yeah, the one that, where did I put that one? It's not a very good picture, sorry. There, that one, the student's journal, yep.
I'll just say, as a context, by complete accident, I happened today to be looking in the University of Minnesota archives, which actually has little folders of the original classes at the university with these student notebooks.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And I found one from 1880 that was an album like this, but that was preceded by about 20 pages of printed instructions
On how to do
on
it.
how to do this album that then was followed by
Yeah.
all kinds of
Yeah,
things.
yeah,
So,
absolutely, yep,
and
yep.
so think about that, you kind of see this in a way as almost the revenge or the attempt upon the printed book to take control of the unruly book.
Yeah,
And then I
yeah,
was struck by in a lot of the other albums you showed, the titles and other things were rebellious, but also rebellious in relation to a notion of the kind of tyrannical print book, right?
absolutely, yeah,
And
yeah.
then sort of connected to John's question, I guess the question I have is, do you think that what you're showing us or what you're working with is a story about print itself? That this is in effect that the sort of relationship
Yeah.
between the printed book from the beginning is always this kind of dialectic between this attempt to print, to fix, to stabilize, to normalize, and the failure constantly of that.
Yeah,
Which would be
that's,
sort of like, we have never had the printed book, we've never really been there. But then the other would be taking these recent historians who look back to this age of the printed book that's being replaced by digital, a sense that there was a period of the printed book. And then it's not about a kind of new dialectic of print itself, but a new periodization. And I'm struck by, Adrian Johns in his account pays great attention to the emergence of the steam press, right at the kind of end of your period. That's for him when fixity really comes in, when the book becomes what we think of it as today.
yeah.
And that would be a new periodization. You're doing a new periodization of the history of print, as opposed to just a rethinking of a dialectic print itself. So-
Yeah, and I'm not sure which of those two, that's so helpful, and I'm not sure which of those two I'm doing yet, partly because I just don't know enough yet. The heyday of extra illustration is the era of the steam press. So kind of all of these great big projects that turned something that was in 6 volumes into something that's now in 21 volumes, those kind of carry through to the First World War, at least. So that would suggest, if I make extra illustrators part of the story, that this is all, we've never had a printed book to steal from your terms. I have some speculation about what becomes of the album, which is, I think it becomes the photograph album after the sort of mid-19th century, or it scales down and it becomes the stuff children do, so it becomes the yearbook. I think there's a pretty direct line between these Stammbucher, who that German immigrants create these boxes, and Midwestern high schools and the kind of yearbook, and the yearbook as sort of repository for autographs. But then, the thing is being infantilized. I have a good friend who grew up in Switzerland, who's my age, who had an album when she was in elementary school. I could have put my photos of her album, which she's kept all this year, in this presentation, but it was exactly the same thing. She went around to her teachers and her classmates, and she got contributions to it. Poems, or people's attempts to draw Disney characters, or things like that. So it's a more long-lived practice if we kind of admit the history of childhood into the picture. This one that I started with, this is my own copy of something, and this, like the things that you were examining in the archive, begins with a long historical lesson about how John Locke instructed you on how to make a commonplace book. And you kind of, you catalog your ideas this way, and you have these topics. And what really wonderfully, somebody has written across the table of contents that she or he is supposed to have used a whole sonnet from Shakespeare. Just sort of, I don't care about kind of the way you're instructing me. I'm going to do this my way. So I think that push and pull is actually a really, really important dimension of how we've always used books. We just kind of forgot it for a little while. Elaine?
I think now my question was also about control and lack of control, and I wonder if the dimension that I want to bring out of JB's question is this idea of low tech and high tech, because you began with the Kindle, and it's supposed to be that this new digital technology kind of gives us this kind of new freedom and autonomy because we're not tied. We don't have to literally be burdened and weighed down by these physical books or just carry the Kindle. But then all of these technologies for kind of exerting your own autonomy and creating your own book are very rudimentary, like so cut and paste, which they try to replicate in the kind of in Word. Or the fact that they've become appropriate as kind of children's act, like, I made a book in first grade, or it's something that any child or the Brontes can do, because using scissors and pasting things is something that kind of this democratization of this practice, and you can also do it. But then, so then in some ways, as books become, or the format becomes more high-tech, we kind of become, we're freed from having to have a physical book, but then that kind of, because we can't make our own, I mean, some people can, but most people can't make their own web page, or it's just a difficult medium. And so this really, the low techness really points out the freedom aspect that you are, which also is an interesting counterpoint to the chance and accidentalness that is like the loss of control aspect. That's really
No, that's incredibly helpful. I have a colleague at Toronto, a librarian named Alan Gailey has been working on a big project about sort of the forensics of digital objects. And to pursue this project, he has to hack into, Kindle editions. And every time he does that, he's violating the licensing agreement, which makes his colleagues very nervous, probably with good reason. And they might have been sort of, as I said, published authors don't like often. You could also, if you remember that Rosamund Vinci in Middlemarch has an album of extracted verse, and like Eliot's narrator is just dripping with scorn about this book. So published authors don't like this, but they're not able to kind of bring the kind of law down upon you for cutting up their books. Yeah.
Just a clarification, I guess. The extra illustrated books, did the people that were doing that actually remove the binding and then start interleaving and then they would rebind? So that's so interesting, especially if that's, I don't know if we want to even go in this direction, but if that's associated with the men, whereas the women of the bound books, if they make mistakes, they have to cut those pages out. Which I thought, when those beautiful pages, I thought, oh, how many times did you marred it, like, no, I can't have that, so cut it out,
Yeah. So I think that cutting pages out is also sort of what we would call unfriending people. In other words, where you no longer want to preserve. I think that's what that poem in the Southern Literary Messenger is about. Right. So it's not just about mistakes. It's like, oh, I don't want to remember that you wrote in my book. And there are lots of, Byron has a poem about albums that is all about ejaculating over blank pages, basically. So there is something about kind of, you can see why, if you're a young woman keeping one of these books and you get a contribution you don't want, your scissors are going to be ready. Yeah, I think that is a basic contrast, though. Maybe the contrast should also be along class lines as well as gender lines, as I'm guessing, because extra illustration was just it could be an extremely costly activity. Often, in addition to sort of cutting up other books, you find cut up manuscripts In other words, manuscript letters, for instance, that somebody has acquired as a collector and that they've bound in. So that gives me a sense of it being a pretty expensive activity.
I'm struck by the visual dimension of many of these. Not this,
Not this
but
one.
the ones that have like the text.
one? Yeah.
Or this one, or even the ones that, or even more by the ones that have the text like lines and all sorts of diagonal,
Yeah.
collage.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. Yeah, same
And,
person.
and I mean, it almost kind of looks like forerunners of abstract conceptual art.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so there's a lot of visual care that goes in from, little illustrations like that and ornaments around, but also sort of the layout of the text itself, that kind of, I mean, it's almost as though, this is homage to a Shakespeare sonnet that I like, but in fact, I spent now, 5 minutes thinking whether I wanted like that or I wanted like that. Or I wanted. So I'm wondering about the visual sensibility and the context. How much of it is in dialogue, not only with texts, but with
Art of the
visual,
period.
art.
Yeah. No. I'm absolutely interested in that. I took out a whole section about how you often get sort of natural history illustrations in these that are done, such a medley, right? So you have, you have your poem by Mary Robinson, and then you have the 4 stages in the life of a particular kind of butterfly that you find at this particular place. And those are often done in an idiom of abstraction that diagrammatically, in ways that you don't associate, say, so much with female accomplishments and much more, say, with sort of scientific illustration of the period. The line between those two things is maybe a fuzzy line. And there's often real sort of trompe-l'oeil, like, here's a feather in a book, and you open, and it looks like a feather in a book, and of course it's painted. And it's as if it's just been dropped in. This is part of the chanciness and contingency, partly because it's not, if it were in a published book, it would not be at an angle like that, right? But it is. And so there's almost a kind of avant-garde practice here in ways that, I'm still finding ways of trying to bring this to a fore that really unsettle our periodization, right? Collage is not usually a word applied to anything before modernism, but it's the only word that works for kind of what I'm finding in these books. And you don't see, partly because it's just very difficult. The only thing I can think of in a printed book is maybe that would be like what these books often do with layout, would be Clarissa's Mad Papers.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's the only thing I can find that would be like that. Maybe some Blake books, but then Blake is more on a continuum with these maybe than with printed books anyways. So again, it's something that I have so many things I need to do in my overly short sabbatical, but I really want to think hard, in addition to thinking hard about kind of what these tell us about what a book is, what they tell us about what an image is in this period seems a really urgent question to me. Oh, I guess, yeah.
Thank you. As you were talking, I kept thinking about the elegant extracts.
Yes,
how popular
indeed.
they were in the period. And in
yeah.
fact, in the chapter from Emma that you quoted, of course, they're copying from elegant extracts into the private anthology.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between printed anthologies and private anthologies.
No, I'd be happy to. In some ways, there's emulation on both sides. I would say. So in some ways, right, somebody's keeping a commonplace book and keeping it properly and not having ferns or wreaths of hair in it, is trying to do for himself or herself what Vicessimus Knox, right, who is the editor of Elegant Extracts, That's right. What he is trying to do and make money from. On the other hand, the literary annuals that start being really popular in the 1820s, I think are trying to do as a commercial product what these books had done in amateur circles. In other words, they're overseen by a particular lady editor who's gathered together contributions from famous poets. So they're emulating they're emulating the manuscript, their printed products emulating the manuscript tradition, suggesting that it is really a two-way street. And the fact that scrapbook, I've found it first in handwriting in these books, before the OED finds it in printed books, seems to me really suggestive of that emulation also being an emulation that's driving publishers who want to try to create a sort of second-order simulated intimacy, maybe, suggest that you are part of the coterie of Lady Blessington when she edits this gift book. Does that answer your question? It's an excellent question.
You noticed a gradual conclusion in photograph albums and high school albums in the 20s, but I'm aware that a decade ago there was a huge boom in scrapbooking. It was an American industry of some scale. I don't know if it's happening in Britain too.
It is.
What was going on there? I speak in the past tense, maybe wrongly, maybe it's still going on. What was going on there, and how literary was that, and how continuous was what you're talking about, or discontinuous?
I think it still is going on, and I believe that it can be quite literary depending upon who is doing it, but that my sense is that it's mainly a sort of multimedia photograph album that has other things in it. There's folklorists and anthropologists are working on scrapbooking now, and I've seen some of the work that they've done. And an Americanist named Mike Chazar has a book about sort of poetry scrapbooks from the 1920s to the 1960s. But scrapbook has become, in those, what it isn't quite in the period that I'm looking at. It's become a word that you reserve for scissoring out or pasting in pre-made things. So things that, clippings or photographs or, gosh, what else do you put in scrapbooks? Bits of fabric, maybe, things that are already made, not necessarily for sort of drawings on the page. The scrap in scrapbook in the late 18th and early 19th century is actually a scrap by analogy with the scraps that a beggar might beg for. It's weird, but the pre-printed, I didn't include a slide like this, but the pre-printed title pages you could buy for albums will often have, say, a picture of a nubile young beggar maid with her basket out and the caption, "Scraps gratefully received," or you'll get another pre-printed title page from this period. Go back to this is a pre-printed title page published by Rudolf Ackerman in this one, in the 1830s, right? There is a little beggar boy there, can you see at the bottom? So it's scrap in the sense of what people with a lot give to people who don't have very much, and so it's an acknowledgement of how these are often assembled by entire social circles. I think we've totally forgotten that sense of scrap in scrapbooks. So there's a discontinuity in that respect. And I don't think these are social enterprises, scrapbooking now in the same way. They might be mother-daughter or sisters, but they're not sort of whole sort of circles of friends anymore. Yeah, John?
Two quick things. One, I suspect there's an analogy, maybe more than an analogy, to quilt making.
Yes, there is, and that's done, and that's drawn, the analogy is made in the period, yeah. Yeah.
And two, the other place, the one place where I know full-blown 1950s scrapbooking survives is the Mormon West. And I think until very recently, BYU television had a weekly broadcast on scrapbooking.
And there is a big chain of scrapbook supply stores that I believe is still going strong, that was founded by, well, but I think it became national and even had a branch in Edinburgh when I was on sabbatical there.
Wow.
I don't know whether that branch survived, but I mean, yes, that was founded by Mormons as well. Yeah.
I was thinking, so quick comment when you made that unfriending joke. I really was thinking that Facebook and other book is more almost akin to the social practices
Absolutely.
of like copy and pasting, sharing images, text,
Yeah.
original, thoughts. Which is a kind of an interesting bookend. to this.
So to speak, yes.
And I just sort of a question or a thought experiment with I'm hearing a lot in the questions, people saying, how is it different from the commonplace book, the scrapbook, the autograph book, and I think that you were reflecting on that too when you were saying how the librarians we don't know what to call these. So I was wondering, do you find it more useful to place this in sort of a transition genre between commonplace books to, I don't know, more fully fledged albums, or is it its own sort of like thing that flourished and doesn't
Yeah.
And I guess that it would be treating it, is it sort of this like weird hybrid genre that popped up and sort of doesn't exist anymore, or is it its genealogy, I guess, would be a question.
I guess I want it to be different things at different moments. Like there are moments when I want to make an argument that says this changed the way people thought about what a poem was. And I feel like, well, that's a very specific argument that I would want to make about, say, poetic practice in the 1820s and 1830s. But when I answer the question, what is a book, which is, I want to make it more of a genealogy. Can I do that, or is that just methodologically hopeless? No, that's an excellent question.
So I don't want to cut off conversation, but I do want, before we thank Professor Lynch, to say that the bookstore is outside and has copies of Loving Literature. And so on your way out, feel free to whip out your checkbooks or your pieces of plastic checkbooks, and you could practice your calligraphy. So thank you very much for a wonderful